Hey guys, I'm Andrew Vass and I'm with eLearning Brothers. This video is a recording of our webinar, Accessibility and Usability, Where Do They Overlap in eLearning? Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we're giving away 15 iPads in December. That's one for every business day in the first 3 weeks. You can learn more about that in the description. Thanks so much. We hope you enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm with eLearning Brothers. Today, we're going to be talking about accessibility and usability and where they overlap in eLearning. This webinar will be recorded. We'll get a copy of the recording sent out to everyone later today. We'll also be posting this recording on our blog later, probably early next week. If you have questions during the webinar, comments, things that you'd like to participate with, please use the questions panel. We'll be looking in that, and I'll try to bring any questions up to our presenter or answer those as I can. Just so you know, one of the things that we like to do after the webinar is try to follow up as soon as possible. Sometimes it's just to get feedback. Most of the time we do want to touch base and see if anybody needs one-on-one clarification on the webinar topics after the fact. We will also be sending everyone a free eLearning Brothers account if you don't already have one, so you can look forward to that in your email inbox. Also, we're giving away 15 iPads in December. We've already started giving them away, so there's less than 15 to go, but we are giving away 15 iPads in December, and I will tell you more about that at the end. All right, so without further ado, we have Laura Silver, the VP of Products at Trivantis, with us today. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the screen over to you, Laura.
All right, great. Okay, hopefully you should be able to see my screen.
I see your presentation. Looks great.
Okay, perfect. All right, let me minimize some of this. Okay, great. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate having the opportunity to be on with the eLearning Brothers team today, talking about one of my favorite topics to talk about, accessibility and usability. This is really a topic and a presentation I've wanted to do for a long time. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to present it today and hopefully get people thinking about how these overlap and one can really lead to the other. And overall, really the goal of today's presentation is to talk about and think about and really prove and justify how more accessible content and more accessible e-learning actually just creates better e-learning for everybody. So Andrew has introduced me. My name is Laura Silver. I'm with Trivantis. I've been with Trivantis for over 10 years now. And one of the things that I've been really lucky and able to do is continue to find ways to improve the support of accessibility, whether it's web content accessibility guidelines or Section 508 for our authoring tools. And so that's something I still continue to champion both within the company and outside of the company as well. So with that, no further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about accessibility and usability. So what we're really going to try to do and answer today are really exploring the overlap and commonalities between accessibility and usability and inclusion when it comes to creating e-learning. Because as we'll talk about, there are so many shared goals and approaches and guidelines when it comes to these different notions and concepts and how one goes about actually implementing them in real life. And so again, I want to illustrate how more accessible courses are actually beneficial for everyone and just make, again, for better courses. And so we're going to answer, what are the differences and similarities between what it means to be accessible and what it means to have usable content or e-learning. And then how can you make a business case for accessible design to your organization, to your supervisors, to your stakeholders, so that they really understand the importance of it. And then we'll talk about, how can accessibility actually lead to improved usability? And I want to look at some very direct, straightforward approaches to doing that. So we'll go through about 10 tips that we can look at that you can start doing today, no matter, really what authoring tool or type of training you're creating. So let's start with defining what we mean by accessibility and usability and just do a little bit of definitions and kind of try to get through that so then we can kind of get to the meat of the presentation. So first, let's talk about accessibility. Accessibility really primarily focuses on people with disabilities. So when we're thinking about accessibility, that's really the audience that we're trying to reach. And so accessibility addresses discriminatory aspects that are related to an equivalent user experience for people with disabilities. And it just means that people with disabilities should be able to equally perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with websites and tools, and in our case, with e-learning or online learning or online content. And it means that they should also be able to contribute equally without barriers. So issues of accessibility generally refer back to the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, which was implemented in 1990. And that mandated that public facilities and services needed to be fully accessible to people with disabilities. And then we had some additional amendments of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 to also mandate equal opportunity for people with disabilities. And in this case, that also meant meeting those accessibility standards for software and hardware and websites and videos and information technology. And that's really where we see the meat of the guidelines relate to e-learning. And the way that we're able to implement those and sort of support that is through the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And so these guidelines and different approaches help us to design accessible web pages or content online, and really serve as benchmarks for what it means to provide that equal and integrated access for such a diverse population. So a more formal definition of accessibility, and I'll just sort of read this straight out, says that a person with a disability is afforded the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services as a person without a disability in an equally effective and equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use. And the person with a disability should be able to obtain the information as fully, equally, and independently as a person without a disability. So that's really the spirit of what we mean when we're thinking about creating accessible e-learning. So we know that we need to provide the same equivalent and full support, but how do we go about doing that? So that goes back to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Right now, we're focusing more on on version 2.0 and level AA, and these cover really a wide range of recommendations for making that content more accessible. But the idea is that by following these guidelines, we make our content accessible to a wider range of people with different types of disabilities, whether it's blindness and low vision, or cognitive limitations, learning disabilities, deafness or hearing loss, limited movement, photosensitivity, or speech disabilities. And so we try to put these all together to create a cohesive and consistent set of guidelines. But unsurprisingly, as you'll see as a theme throughout this hour, a lot of these accessibility requirements benefit people and situations beyond just disabilities. So people who have low literacy or are not fluent in the primary language that you're providing your content. So maybe English isn't their first language. People who have low bandwidth connections, maybe they're accessing your e-learning on a plane, on a train, or maybe they're out to sea and they're on a submarine, certainly could be the case. Or people who are using older technologies, maybe they're limited by their IT organizations. We might find learners who are new to e-learning, who are infrequent users of e-learning, and then certainly people who are accessing learning on a mobile device. We've found that following these accessibility guidelines not only supports people with disabilities, but actually benefits a whole diverse range of audiences. But the primary focus, again, of these accessibility guidelines is focused on people with disabilities. Some of the requirements are more technical. They relate to really the underlying code versus really the visual appearance of the e-learning. And a lot of that reason is because we're thinking about how our content online works with assistive technologies. So that might be something like screen readers that read content aloud. And we often find that a lot of what we're thinking about with accessibility is just sort of focusing mostly on, does it work well with a screen reader, NVDA or JAWS? But there's also other types of assistive technology. There's screen magnifiers that enlarge the content, and voice recognition software. And so we see this often more as a focus when we're thinking about accessibility, and things like usability research and practice tend to sort of get pushed to the sidelines. And then other requirements do relate to user interaction and visual design. So thinking about, Can we make our instructions understandable? Do we have good notifications and error handling and feedback to help people with cognitive and learning disabilities? And so in those cases, we do find that those guidelines help with better usability. So all in all, we'll find that the guidelines and the success criteria for WCAG or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are organized around these 4 principles that you see here on the screen. Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And perceivable just means that the information and the UI, the visual design of the page, is presentable to users in ways that they can perceive. So just think of this as meaning, available to the senses. So if something is presented in visual media, like image or video, you want to make sure that you provide alternative text or text descriptions for blind or low vision users. And then if the content is auditory, you want to make sure that you have a transcript available. Operable just means, operable, that the user interface components, the navigation, all of the things must be operable by all types of learners. So the interface can't require an interaction that the learner simply can't perform. So we want to make sure that things like adaptive technology or assistive technology, keyboards, all of that can be used to interact with your course and complete the course satisfactorily and successfully. Understandable just means that users should be able to understand the information as well as how to operate the course. Do they know how to navigate through it? How to work within with the interactions? Make sure that the content is very clear. It's not ambiguous and overly complex. Just make it simple and concise. And the robust means that the content should be able to be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. So hopefully this gives us a good understanding of the principles that underlie creating accessible content on the web. So let's take a quick look then at the definition of usability. So usability is about designing products, or in our case, e-learning, to be effective, efficient, and satisfying. Those are really the 3 principles there. And we'll find that unfortunately, these usability practices and research don't often address the needs of people with disabilities. So this is where we start to see a little bit of a disconnect. There's a lot of dimensions to usability, but generally these are the 3 issues of importance. So effectiveness deals with whether the user can do what they want to do on your e-learning, on your course. Can they achieve their goals and complete their task in a way that's accurate? Efficiency looks at how much effort it takes the user to achieve those goals. So how much time is needed to complete the task and how many resources are expanded by the user to achieve that task. And then finally, satisfaction just measures the user's perception of ease of use of your site. What is their acceptability of the content? Of course, all of these dimensions are really affected by variables like context or situation in which the e-learning is being used, as well as the learners themselves, and then certainly the goals that you have that you're working to achieve with your content. So that's where the dimension of users with disabilities and assistive technologies should really, of course, come into play. There's also a couple of dimensions additional to the 3 that we just went over that are specific to usability for e-learning. There's the quality of learning, the quality of teaching, the quality of the learning environment, and the quality of the interaction. So some of the principles that you would follow to make sure that your e-learning is usable is just making sure that your lessons are well organized, that they encourage both interaction and self-reflection, that you have feedback that should be available and helpful. Your navigation tool should be obvious. You should have help available and things should be visually appealing. And then, you want to make sure that you minimize errors, but at the same time that if you do have an error, you have easy recovery. So those are just some additional aspects to thinking about usability as it relates to e-learning. Now, what happens when you combine accessibility with usability? So that's where we start to see this overlap. And the concept that I want to talk about now is called universal design. Universal design is more of a proactive way to ensure that your content or your e-learning or your product or anything really is accessible to everyone. And so this is this concept of inclusion, actively including and supporting students of varying abilities, within your environment without this concept of segregation. So it really combines making courses accessible and usable and inclusive for the broadest audience possible. There's a definition that comes from the Center for Universal Design that says that the design of products and environments to be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. So I think this is really where accessibility begins to overlap with usability. We think about creating e-learning that appeals to the widest audience possible. And the most important principle here, again, is inclusion. It's about diversity, ensuring involvement of everyone to the greatest extent possible and addressing a broad range of issues. People with disabilities, people who have, access to differing levels of quality of hardware and software and internet connectivity, people with differing levels of computer literacy and skills, or economic situations, education, geographic location, culture, age, and language. So universal design really kind of goes above and beyond just thinking about usability and just thinking about accessibility in terms of people with disabilities. We actually see examples of universal design every day in our world, and we likely don't even notice it at all. So I think about sidewalks with curb cuts. I know I use them all the time when I'm pushing my son along in a stroller on the street in the city, and I need to get through, and I see delivery men and women who are using them to get packages across the street within their carts and their rollers. You see that there's a tactile element here, so people who are using walking sticks and need help to understand where the end of the street comes, it's useful for them. And then certainly people who are in wheelchairs. And then you find people who are even skating or roller skating or on skateboards, and things like a curb cutout, something we don't even really think about, we just use it every day. That's universal design. Then we have just sort of the doors that open automatically when we go into a lot of different buildings. So again, they benefit the same kind of different people. If you're carrying a large package, you don't have access to your hands at the moment, you're carrying a child, you're pushing something along, having those doors open automatically is extremely helpful to a wide variety of people, not just people with disabilities. And then I think about, when I'm traveling in an airport and there's closed captions on, and I have to tell you, I used closed captions almost all the time for when I'm watching TV at home. I'm a big user of closed captions when it's at night and I don't want to wake anyone. And so I find that it's not just a matter of, having an issue with hearing loss. Closed captions are really usable for a large audience of people. And then we look at ramps and all the different types of people who take advantage of ramps within this physical space. And so you can see that universal design sort of within our everyday world, within architecture, it makes sense and there's a reason for it. And so we would conclude that we would want to take advantage of universal design as it relates to e-learning as well. So there is a concept called universal design for learning. It comes to us from CAST, or the Center on Applied Special Technology. And it also comes with its own core principle. So in the hopes that I don't sort of overload you with different principles that conflict or contrast, we'll just spend a little time on this before we kind of get into those approaches. And so again, the idea of universal design for learning, as with universal design, is just to be proactive in our thinking when it comes to online course development, making it accessible to the greatest number of people that might take our course. That's not to say that at some points you might need to provide an accommodation. Think about, maybe a separate page or branching your learner somewhere else. I often see courses that will ask up front if a person is using assistive technology and might take them in a different direction, or keep that in mind when it comes to certain pages or interactions. We just want to keep that approach to a minimum. We're not talking about having a full second text-only course. That's the absolute kind of opposite of what we're really trying to achieve here with universal design for learning. It just recognizes that a one-size-fits-all approach for learning isn't really going to work for our learners. We want to provide flexible and varying means of engagement, different ways to represent that learning, allow for a more inclusive learning and teaching environment for all learners. So we kind of have three principles here. We have multiple means of engagement, which means to really kind of stimulate motivation and sustain enthusiasm for our learning by just promoting various ways of engaging with the material. So maybe it's not just some text, maybe it's some text and an image, and some video. Multiple means of representation means that we present the information and content in a variety of ways, just to support understanding by students with different learning styles and abilities. And then multiple means of action and expression just means to offer options for students to demonstrate their learning in various ways, like different types of assessment types. So maybe it's not just a multiple choice question. So these are just some things to keep in mind as we're thinking about creating learning that benefits people in terms of accessibility as well as usability. So we know that universal design and accessibility and usability are all extremely important. But how do we demonstrate that throughout our organization? How can we make a business case to really justify the need both quantitatively and qualitatively? So let's think a little bit about why does this matter? First, and probably most obviously, really are the legal risks. We have laws on the books that make it illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. In all spaces, all areas of public life that are open to the general public, and that includes our online learning. We know this is the case for local government agencies and state and federal. We see it with academic institutions and more, increasingly in the private sector. WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that we just went over, those have been the standard that have been used by the Department of Justice when it comes to web accessibility litigation since 2017. And there are a lot of suits and litigation when it comes to web accessibility. In fact, in the first half of 2018, there were over 1,000 cases reported, which is actually almost double the number of reported cases in the second half of 2017. That's a really steep increase in lawsuits. So businesses are really at risk more than ever when it comes to the need to be compliant and the risks for not doing so. In fact, ADA web accessibility related lawsuits are among the fastest growing in the US in terms of commercial law litigation. So this is just something to keep in mind, and it just means that every company with a digital presence could be a target for lawsuits, and it's very costly. So just one example, in a 2008 settlement by the National Federation for the Blind with Target, the retailer we all know and love, Target, resulted in class damages of $6 million, plaintiff legal fees of over $3 million, undisclosed defense legal fees, and then there was court oversight of their website for several years. So the idea here really is just that companies need to be prepared to protect themselves through proactive and ongoing web accessibility efforts. And so this is just one reason, one way to create that business case for the need for accessibility and the risk for not complying with those accessibility laws and guidelines. But it goes just beyond, legal compliance and financial risk, of course. There was actually a really interesting study that was commissioned by Microsoft and conducted by Forrester a few years ago. And they concluded that there were just numerous benefits to supporting accessibility initiatives in your organization above and beyond, again, the financial risk and that legal compliance. So there's cost cutting. They concluded that accessibility could contribute to cost savings, specifically by integrating it into your existing and ongoing development cycle. So again, it's about being proactive, designing for accessibility upfront, because having to go back and update your technology, redesign your content to make it accessible along with other best practices is a lot more expensive than thinking about it upfront. There's workforce productivity and diversity. So not just the public sector organizations that were part of the study, but the private organizations as well, noted that their accessibility strategy really helped them retain employees, even those who just became temporarily disabled as well. And it helped them retain their knowledge and their skills and their talent by reducing turnover and increasing that productivity. There's just the public good, this concept of corporate social responsibility, right? That fares well for both employees and clients alike. So just the idea of having an accessibility initiative and help them putting together a better social vision for their company. And there's certainly benefits that are tangible when it comes to that as well. And then boost in employee morale. So over 80% of the private sector organizations in the study and over 70% of the public, they agreed that having accessibility just raised morale among employees. So these are just a few of the benefits you can see on the screen here. There's really a list. There are many and they're varied. So hopefully this helps you to create your own business case for accessibility and accessible e-learning within your organization. So now we know the what is accessibility and usability and universal design. We've covered a little bit of the why. So now I really want to get into the how. I want to talk about 10 practical approaches that you can use to create more accessible e-learning. And then we're going to talk about, as we do that, really, of course, how that makes for better e-learning, how it makes for more usable e-learning for everyone. Because I'm from Trivantis, some of my examples will show, Lectora and how you can implement these in Lectora where applicable. And so we'll use a few of those as examples as well. So we'll talk about consistent navigation. Seems straightforward so far. I want these all to be really, really straightforward. Consistent navigation, transcripts and captions, keyboard-only support, form labels, color contrast, using straightforward language, chunking your content and using markup, using descriptive links and focus states, and then making sure you're not just using color alone to convey meaning. So let's get started. All right, so the first one is just having consistent navigation. So using your navigation, kind of having the same across your pages, is just an important way to maximize your course's accessibility, especially to those who have reading or cognitive disabilities. But again, everybody benefits, because every time you take a new course, and it's going to take you a few seconds to sort of like adjust to that unique layout and user interface of the module. So having to do that, every time you load a page, it's going to really sort of create a lot of dissonance and take away and detract from the learning you're trying to do. So you want to keep your consistent navigation from page to page, keep your course name and your chapter name and your breadcrumbs in the same place, keep your navigation in the same place, just make it really obvious. There's no need to make it surprising for everybody. You just want to have a consistent interface across your course so that your users can really find the main content without having to look for it. You want them to get right to the learning, not have to think about how to access their navigation. So you just want to make it really easy to locate and identify menus and links and text sections, make sure it's predictable and consistent. This also includes, form labels and instructions, making sure they're really well associated with their controls. What I mean by that is having labels actually next to the form objects, and we'll talk about that when we look at form labels as well and why that's important. So this isn't just important for people who might have cognitive disabilities, but it's important for people with low vision. So imagine that you're using a screen magnifier and you're only looking at one part of your screen at a time. If you can only see one portion of your screen at a time and you're sort of moving around so you can find what you need, having it be in a consistent place from page to page is extremely important. You want to really focus on clarity and consistency here. And of course, this just makes it more usable for everyone who's maybe new to the course, who isn't really technically savvy. And another reason is for people who are on mobile devices. So if you're on a tablet or any kind of smaller screen, if you're in a hurry or distracted, you don't want to think about page to page how you're going to get through the course. So this one's hopefully pretty straightforward. All right, then we have transcripts and captions. So one of the groups of learners with special accessibility needs are those who are hearing impaired. So they're going to need written equivalents for any audio or video content that you have in your course. And we do this through transcripts and captions. But transcripts are extremely beneficial for all kinds of users, not just those who have hearing disabilities. So I know that sometimes I'm in an environment where I just don't want to listen to the audio or necessarily watch the video. People who don't want to spend that time, they'd rather really skim the transcript. You might have people who have cognitive disabilities who just have difficulty processing auditory information, or people who just aren't proficient in that language, who find it easier to read than listen. You might have people with low bandwidth connections. They don't want to stream or download the audio or video file. Who don't want to pay for that bandwidth usage if they're on their mobile devices. Maybe they're in a noisy environment or a crowded environment, and they don't want to play the audio because they can't hear it. Or maybe it's the opposite, they're in a really quiet environment. They're right next to their colleagues and they don't want to play the audio or video, they don't have a headset. They don't want to disturb their colleagues or employees. So those are some reasons why having transcripts and closed captions as well is beneficial, not just for accessibility reasons, it's just good usability for your course. So we've got transcripts, which is just essentially a transcript of everything going on within the audio. So it might not just be the spoken words, but things that are happening within the video file as well. And then captions is when the text is synchronized with the audio. So this is important when people need to see what's happening in the video and get the audio information in text at the same time. So you can do this for your video and your audio as well. You can include things like not just the words that are spoken, who's speaking, if it's something like an interview between two people, different sounds like music and laughter and noises, and there's ways to emphasize that differently within the captions. So I want to show you two examples here of transcripts and captions. Let me open these up. So this is just an example of a transcript written kind of within the web page. You don't have to download it, which makes it really nice, very easy to access, and it's just an interview between two people. So you can see that there's it's very obvious who's speaking, and just kind of goes back and forth. So very straightforward transcript of a podcast interview. And here we have another example of a transcript that I liked from the New York Times. This is a more interactive transcript. So you can see that it's really it's got some timing elements here. But again, it's just going through the time and the text that's being spoken. Very straightforward, but very, very beneficial for everybody. When it comes to creating captions, there's a number of different formats for doing that. In Lectora, you're able to create captions really easily. We provide samples of the different types. WebVPT is one of the preferred types, as well as SRT formats and XML format. You can see what it looks like over here on the right. It's really just a matter of choosing the start time and the end time and what the text is that you want to show on the screen. And it's really just sort of built right into the way that you're adding your audio and video directly in the course. So if you have some time at the end and you want to see kind of how it works in more detail, I'm happy to go into that for you. So again, transcripts and captions are great for all different types of audiences. If you might want to think about doing these up front, you can very easily sort of export them and get them translated. So that's another benefit of doing them as well, is thinking about localization. It's just nice to have captions and being able to see those facial expressions at the same time if you think about closed captions. So again, it's not just people who are deaf and can't hear their audio or people who are hard of hearing. We've got people who are using their mobile phones, people who are maybe have temporary disabilities, maybe lost their glasses. Maybe they're in a challenging environment where they can't hear the audio. So there's lots of different reasons for using transcripts and captions. Okay, so now let's talk about keyboard only support. Keyboard accessibility is really one of sort of the main and most critical aspects of web accessibility. The idea is that you should be able to unplug your mouse and go through your course just using your keyboard successfully. So I should be able to tab through and use keystrokes to get between my links and my buttons and my forms and my tests, submit what I need to submit, get through the pages successfully. And that's really kind of a major way to test for how accessible your content is. People who with physical disabilities who simply can't use a mouse would depend on having this type of support or feature. So that might not be a permanent disability. You can see from this picture, someone might have sprained their wrist, or I think about even a reason when I'm traveling and I'm just using my laptop and I'm not going to plug my mouse in. I'm sitting on a plane and I'm trying to do work. I'm not going to necessarily want to. I hate using that touch screen, so I'm always just tabbing around. People who are blind and they can't see the mouse pointer on the screen and they're relying on assistive technology to read the screen aloud. People who have chronic conditions that really need to limit their use of a mouse or avoid it altogether. Anyone who's dependent on a keyboard to navigate content is going to benefit from keyboard-only support. And as I mentioned, it's good for people, above and beyond permanent disabilities as well. So you just want to make sure that your tab order is very logical. that you're allowing for keyboard navigation around the content and the controls in a way that someone would anticipate and expect. Because that order is really going to be essential, not only for the keyboard navigation, but for the way that assistive technology reads aloud the content. So it should really follow the visual flow of the page, left to right, top to bottom, go through the header and the navigation, content buttons and input, and then the footer. You want to allow for people to jump between blocks of content and controls. That's where we think about that skip navigation link, so someone doesn't have to necessarily tab through or hear read aloud the same next, back, help, content, whatever buttons over and over again. Something to think about is avoiding keyboard traps. So you don't want to get them tabbed into a situation that they can't actually tab out of. So that's something you want to test with. So again, just test your course without your mouse. Make sure you can use your enter button to select an element, that everything is predictable and in order. And if you can do that, then you're good to go. This is a good way to test for keyboard only support. Okay, so then we have form labels. So I promised I would get back to this, and now I am. So form labels are really important for clarity and understanding. Again, they help people with assistive technology like screen readers like JAWS or NVDA, as well as people who are using screen magnifiers, and they just help people better understand the purpose of the form. So when we speak of forms, I'm not just talking about, enter your name and click submit. When we talk about forms as it relates to e-learning, we're also talking about questions, because those are made up of form objects. So they help people understand what they should do and write in a form, and what the purpose of the form is, and why they're in this form altogether. So you really want to make sure that the individual has enough information to complete those tasks without having to think about it too hard. Most authoring tools like Lectora are going to automatically take care of those form labels for you. So as you can see here, radio buttons and checkboxes will automatically include a label for you that is programmatically tied to the radio button. So an assistive technology would know what that radio button's label is and be able to read it out loud. And I would be able to also, using my mouse or my keyboard, select the label in order to select the radio button or checkbox. In Lectora, for example, there is a difference with drop-down lists and list boxes and entry fields. You have to remember to add your own label. So to do that, you simply add a text block. Using the text block properties, you just say it is a label for that specific form element, and now they're programmatically tied together. So it's just something to keep in mind. Rather than using like placeholder text, which would go right within the entry field to indicate what you want the user to answer, well, that goes away as soon as I click into the entry field. And then I might not remember that. So we want to use those labels. If someone is using a screen magnifier, we want to make sure that those labels are really close to their associated form objects. Remember to check things like those entry fields and drop downs. They don't automatically necessarily come with those labels. And then remember, this applies to questions as well. So it's not just the kind of the form that you see here, but the different types of questions. So that's form labels. All right, and then we have color contrast. So this just means having a really sufficient contrast between the foreground and the background colors of your course. And it just makes things more distinguishable and easier to read. So this isn't just sort of the colors in your UI, but you got to think about this when it comes to images, icons, and buttons as well. Think about it when you're conveying information on diagrams or maps. You just want to make sure all of your images are really distinguishable and all of your text is really legible. So people who have low contrast sensitivity, which is certainly common in older people, people with color blindness who can't distinguish well between certain colors, are going to really depend on this feature. But again, it benefits more than just people with disabilities. If you're thinking about people who are in different lighting conditions that might have glare or sunlight, who can't see the screen well, and just people who don't necessarily have specific visual conditions, having an easier time reading the course is just going to make them for a more successful e-learning, certainly. So there's a lot of tools that are available to help you check appropriate color combinations and check your color contrast. There's one linked up here, and so if you go to this link, you'll find a contrast checker. There's a lot of browser plugins that will help you really, really quickly check the contrast of your course, and just make sure that you think about this up front as you're designing, again, so you don't have to go back and rejigger your course because you didn't think about this up front. When it comes to WCAG, and those specific requirements, they have a specific contrast level that they expect for AA compliance, which is 4.5 to 1. So you can see exactly what that looks like when it comes to different color combinations here on the screen. As you get into larger text, like big headings, heavier fonts, the contrast is a little bit more forgiving. But what I think is really interesting here is you can see on the left some really good examples of good contrast, and then bad contrast on the right. And then on the further over to the right we go, this is actually what this would look like to somebody who is colorblind. So you can see that that contrast gets even worse. So it is definitely something that we want to think about and check for. So that's color contrast. Again, I think a lot of these things are really straightforward. We just don't always remember to think about them as we're designing up front. Okay, so then we have straightforward language. So this is important for people with reading or cognitive disabilities. It's also really important for people whose first language isn't the one that you write in necessarily. But from a usability point of view, it really helps everyone. When you're reading from your screen, it can make your eyes really tired. So we want to write in short, clear sentences and paragraphs and avoid unnecessarily complex words and phrases. You might want to use a glossary for terms that readers might not know. You would want to think about expanding your acronyms so you're not just assuming people know what you're talking about when you say things like WCAG. And then think about using like list formatting as appropriate, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then using different methods of representation like images, video, audio, and symbols to help clarify meaning. So we just want to use really not only clear language, but also clear layout and design with, again, that consistent navigation. So this brings us to the next one, which is chunking content with markup. So we often hear about the concept of chunking content with instructional design, which is just that strategy of breaking up your content into shorter bite-sized pieces that are just more manageable, easier to remember. But it's also a really good principle for creating more accessible and usable and inclusive content. It's important from an accessibility point of view, specifically for screen readers who are navigating the pages and who really depend on using things like headings and bulleted lists, things of that nature. The structure and the markup of the HTML that makes up the page helps screen readers understand how to announce that page in a way that's actually logical and sensible. And so that's why it's important from an accessibility point of view, but it's also really good for usability as well. So some of the things we want to think about, headings. So headings like actually specifically marking and noting that your text is a heading, not just making it bold and big. We want to tell the underlying HTML that this is a heading. We want to do that in a hierarchical, logical order. So we can use H1, H2, H3. Lectora goes down to H6 if you need it. And so that's something we want to take advantage of as we're breaking up our content into chunks. We want to think about having headings at the top. So we want to use headings and subheadings. We want to use our bulleted and our numbered lists correctly so they actually make sense and not just for decorative purposes. So we want to use an unordered list when there's no order of sequence or importance. Ordered lists for when there's a specific order we want to follow. So use them correctly and for the right purposes. We want to group those form elements like our labels and our radio buttons within an actual form object. So assistive technology knows that it's specifically a form. So those are just some of the ways that we want to do it from an underlying assistive technology perspective. But again, as you can see visually, it makes sense as well. Here's a nice little example of a great header, good spacing, and a good bulleted list. But I stole some.
So a question has come up on this one. Are you aware regarding HTML headings, if the authoring tools, this person particularly uses Adobe Captivate, but are you aware if authoring tools do this already when creating courses automatically?
I would, I know Lectora does not, so I would guess that the others don't as well. You really want to make sure that you programmatically set it. So within Lectora, let me pull it up and I can show you. There is a specific property that you set for that text block to say this is H1, H2, H3, and so on.
Okay. We did have one other question. It doesn't necessarily apply to this section, but if you can't use a mouse, how do you engage users in drag and drop interactions? I find those question types to be the most interesting to keep the user's interest, but can be difficult without a mouse. Do you have any insight on that?
So that's a great question. Some question types like drag and drop and hotspot questions, I know in the case for Lectora, are simply not accessible because they do just require the use of the mouse. So in that case, if you really do want to use a drag and drop question, you might want to consider branching your learners so that those who are dependent on assistive technology, who are keyboard dependent, might go to a multiple choice question. And then those who aren't would actually branch to the drag and drop question. But that one at this time is mouse dependent, so it's just simply not accessible. We have in Lectora an accessibility check tool. So if you were using something like a drag and drop question, you would actually get an error just letting you know that that wasn't accessible. But that doesn't mean that you can't use it. You might just want to think about alternative ways. In this case, that might be a time when you would want to use a separate accommodation for somebody who was dependent on their keyboard.
Okay, great. We have a response from Melanie for Jennifer's question about Adobe Captivate and HTML headings. Melanie says, not only does Captivate not do markup, but it does not provide a way to include it. So that's something that you'll need to make a workaround with.
Yeah.
Paul says, I would also add, if you support mobile, you would want to get away from drag and drop, and you can write them in ways that are interesting. Dragging isn't always the only way to make it engaging. There's lots of different ways to engage your learners.
Yeah, of course. There's always great ways to think about creating more engaging types of questions, not necessarily just relying on the good old multiple choice or true false, thinking about really, immersing someone within a scenario, making them think about what they would do in that scenario. And it can be really hard on a mobile device, certainly, to really try to use your finger to drag and drop. Just to answer the question in terms of Lectora, you can see here I've added a text block. I'm in the text properties ribbon, and there's an HTML text type dropdown that goes from H1 to H6. So that's what I would typically set. So if I was using something like a design theme to set the overall consistent navigation for my course, I might typically set my course title as H1 and my page title as H2, or even just my course title as H2, just depending. You can start with H2 if you want. Thanks, Ginger. Those were great questions. Did you have any else?
One more has come in from Ben. Do you find that there are features of a content authoring tool that you have to forfeit because you're developing for accessibility? What are some of these, and how can you simulate accessible versions of these types of interactions?
Sure. So that kind of goes back to the question we were talking about with drag and drop questions. There are certainly, in every case, unfortunately, different types of objects. I know in Lectora, the menu object, for example, or question types like the drag and drop question type that really do rely on a mouse to be navigated or used successfully. And so in that case, we wouldn't want to use them when we're creating accessible content. But one of the things that we do in Lectora is even though we have within your title options a use web accessibility settings option that actually enables further settings like reading order and the language of the text and the language of the course, we don't disable anything because we do find that a lot of courses will branch. And so it might be a case of asking upfront specific needs, specific requirements or dependencies of your learners so you can branch them. So it's pretty easy to ask that question, and then you've got a stored variable. And then you might want to say, just use conditional actions to say if assistive technology equals yes, take them to this page, otherwise take them to that page, or show and hide certain things on the page as well. One of the things I found is creating, feedback or pop-ups can be a little cumbersome because you want to actually change the focus of the page. So if I have, a text block on the page that's, hidden and then I show it later on, once the page has already been loaded, that's not going to be accessible to people using screen readers. So we found a lot of kind of interesting ways to get around that by just keeping it on the page and putting something over it to hide it. So there's no reason to forfeit good instructionally sound content, engaging content, still being creative, even though there are some objects or elements that simply aren't accessible. And we do actually have some webinars from Trivantis that we've done in the past with clients who've been able to show some creative ways to do that. All right, so we've talked about chunking our content with markup, good for instructional design, good for usability, good for accessibility. Just a couple more. Descriptive links. So this is something that I see a lot, and I know in the past I've been guilty of it myself. I was thinking about a course I made many years ago on accessibility, and I had learned more links sort of everywhere. And so you can see here, if we're looking at this dialogue, this is what a links list looks like with JAWS. So visually impaired learners who are using assistive technology like JAWS to really announce the content on the page will often just want to go through and sort of scan through to get to the actual links. Now you can imagine if I were to pull up a list of links and all of them said click here, I would have no idea what the purpose of those links are. So we always want to use really visually or really descriptive links. And this is good for learners who are visually tabbing through as well. So you imagine you get to a page. I mean, I think about, when I'm doing research on the web and I'm going through and I'm really trying to find what I need. If the links aren't descriptive, it's just not going to be helpful. So we don't want to use things like read more or click here, or we don't even have to say link to. We just want to use, what the purpose or the destination of the link is. And if there's a file type associated with it, we want to put that in there as well. Just ensure it makes sense out of context. So I think this is kind of a gotcha that sometimes people can forget about. There's also the concept of focus states. So those big kind of blue or orange or brightly colored outlines around interactive elements on your page that are going to show up around buttons or links or anything that requires an input. Those are called focus indicators. So these are key to accessible content. They also improve usability. You'll find them kind of with any .gov type of website that you go to because they are required for WCAG. So you want to make sure that anything that a learner can focus on or requires their input has that nice focus indicator around it. With Lectora, you can actually design the color and the width to be customized to sort of match the look and feel of your course, but you just want to make sure it's really highly visible. It has good contrast and it stands out from the rest of the content. So I know this is really good for people who use their keyboard as the primary means of sort of getting around, like think about power users. Not just people with limited mobility, people who are, low vision or cognitive disabilities. It's good for those power users as well. And I'll tell a really quick funny story. My husband was once called in to do some usability testing for a travel website. And so he's sitting on sort of the inside room, and he's got someone next to him. And then, beyond is sort of that two-way mirror, and the people are watching everything he's doing. And he's going through the site and he's tabbing through it, tab, 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 tab. He's a power user. And the people in the back were totally and utterly freaking out because they had just simply not anticipated anybody tabbing through the site. They only thought about people using the mouse, and they had to stop the test, and the people had to come out and were whispering frantically to the person who was moderating the test and told them, you have to stop using your tab key. And so this is just, really a real life use case of when thinking about keyboard accessibility is extremely important and often overlooked. So having these focus indicators helps people like power users who are just trying to get through the content with their keyboard, people with low vision, anyone who's using a screen reader. These are all good use cases for using that focus state. And again, this is built into Lectora to help us make sure that we meet the WCAG 2.0 AA guidelines. All right, and then last but not least is just making sure that you're not just using color alone as a visual cue when you're communicating something important. So if someone has color blindness or low visual acuity or no vision, that could be very, very difficult. So we're looking at kind of two examples here. It's really obvious kind of what the meaning of this chart is and what labels go with what areas. We're using nice contrasting colors, very descriptive labels, and they're within the area they should be. And then over here on the right, we have sort of low contrast, and it would be very difficult to understand this if I had issues with my vision. So really one of the best ways for testing this is just printing your course in black and white and just making sure you can understand everything in it. So this would apply to things like these charts and graphs that can be hard to read if you're just relying on color alone to distinguish the data. Another example I often see is with forms and submitting forms or submitting questions. When something is marked as required, all you get is maybe that little red color. If I wasn't able to see that red color, I wouldn't know it was required. So we want to use good visual cues as like font weights or underlining or asterisks and not just color. So I often find that color might just be used for errors or notifications, and we don't want that to be the case. So really, those are the main ones. I had a few more I had to cut for time, but I really wanted to focus ones on that I thought were really practical approaches, really straightforward, just things that we don't always think about up front. They can kind of get us in the end. And again, hopefully you've been able to see that great overlap between accessibility and usability, and how doing that just makes for inclusive and better, more effective e-learning. And then last but not least, I've just listed some resources that I use a lot to help me, and hopefully you'll find them helpful as well if you want to just screenshot them. And that's all I had, Andrew.
That is great. Thank you, Laura. We've had a few more questions. We've got 3 minutes if you can answer a couple more questions here.
Absolutely.
Ingrid says, how would you make a screen recording or screencast accessible? We do a lot of demos and try me type of videos as a software company. Any tips?
Yeah, I think certainly if you're doing a tutorial on how to use software, then the best guess is your audience is able to use that software. So you just want to make sure that you're taking advantage of anything you do for any video, like having your transcript, making it really obvious, not only the words that are being spoken, but also the action that's being taken within the video, I think would be really helpful as well. And you may want to consider something like a printout resource that's sort of almost like a notes page with PowerPoint, where you have different screens and then the notes next to each screen. That could be really helpful as well. So it's not necessarily has to be viewed live in real time.
Excellent. Ben says publishing content from some authoring tools, even to HTML5, would produce an SWF file that may not be purely text-based browser content that can be read by screen readers. What are your thoughts about this, especially with the depreciation and eventual phasing out of Flash movies? Do you find this behavior present in Lectora?
Yeah, so one of the things that we actually just came out with in Lectora 18 to help with this, because we actually found that a lot of learning management systems were starting to yell at the SCORM content being imported, was a new publish option. And so, of course, if you're going to put in your own Flash movies, there's not much we can do. We just simply recommend that you don't do that. You use MP4, and we have a lot of ways to convert different file types to MP4 to really encourage that. We also have a publish option now that says HTML only. So even though Lectora has always only published HTML, we've never published to Flash. Other authoring tools have done that, and often the accessibility really relies on that Flash. Lectora is really just straight up HTML, but in the past we've used some elements, specifically like video and audio players that were Swift files. And so now if you select this HTML5 only option, you'll find that we strip all of those out so that you don't have them at all. So again, it's just making sure that you're not including any Flash movies, and then if you use options like that, you'll have a completely Flash-free publish.
Wonderful. All right, so we have a couple more questions, and I'm going to ask my friend Stephanie, who's on here, to write those questions down so that we can get them answered in the blog. I just wanted to take the last minute to make sure I told you guys about the iPads. I mentioned that at the beginning. eLearning Brothers has been giving away iPads. We've given one away for every day, every business day in December, and we're going to keep doing that until the end of next week. The way you can get on that list to win an iPad is to go to elearningbrothers.com/webinar iPad giveaway 2018. I will also send a link to that in the email later today. It's just to schedule a demo. Let us show you some of the cool stuff that we are going to be releasing in 2019, and you could win an iPad. It's been really great. Thank you so much, Laura, for this information. Like I said, we'll ask you a couple more questions and get those posted in the blog next week. Thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching this recording of accessibility and usability. Where do they overlap in e-learning? Subscribe to our channel to get more awesome presentations, ideas, and e-learning videos that can help you become an e-learning rockstar. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and leave your comments below. And don't forget, we're giving away 15 iPads in December. That's one for every business day in the first 3 weeks. You can learn more about that in the description as well. Thanks!